I would say that for me, what I make and how I make it are deeply intertwined. My sculptural artworks in the last year have become these metal frames to which I then attach ceramics and wool. I primarily make these out of found pieces of scrap metal, which have been used and then discarded by other students. These are often attempts at learning how to weld or accidents in shaping or cutting the metal. And I see these mistakes or errors or abandoned ideas as an impulse, where I get to continue or reuse what the previous owner has deemed unusable. For example, in this case, both of the circles used in the base had been bent by other people, but I saw them as working well together, and then put them together as a base, and then bend another piece of metal, add a wooden pieces to it, and then with both that shape of metal and with the circular wooden pieces was able to continue that shape into a sort of crown. My decision to use steel but also wool and ceramics comes out of an interest in ecology and the potential decomposition of these materials. I like the idea that the sculptures might fall apart or crash or disappear or build new ecosystems over a century or two or many. Steel takes 200 to 300 years to decompose, and of course some ceramics exist for thousands of years. So they have these sort of long life forms, which has led me into an interest in the potential future archaeologies of my sculptures as well. I make my sculptures in a way that is quite intuitive, where I gather and then connect these different materials, and then often also take them apart and reconfigure them or make variations of the same sculpture that takes on different forms over time. I would like to relate this type of making to ad hocism. This is a term coined by Charles Jenks that describes ways of creating, especially in reference to architecture, which are driven by like an ad hoc behavior or impulses. I'm particularly drawn to point 3 of Jenks and Nathaniel Silver's ad hoc manifesto. This is, ad hocism is the style of eureka. It is the original moment of new things, when the forms are typically hybrid and, like all creative instants, the conjunction of previously separated systems. Hence, the style must remain heterogeneous to be understood. Like the best surrealism, when seen for the first time, it is experienced as an incongruous marriage, often the copulation of incommensurable things. And I think that sort of explains quite well how I make and what I make. I struggle to find artists to compare my work to because the harshness of metal, the domesticity of ceramics, and the softness of wool does represent a copulation of incommensurable things. The moment of eureka is also how I feel when I put together pieces and just see it all click together. So I do just start off with a lot of material and let that guide me, and then end up with things that have these different variations of detail and non-detail, roughness and softness. My ceramics shapes are quite random too. I usually determine the size, but then really let the clay guide me when I form it. And sometimes I will then even use the same ceramic object in different structures and like reuse it and see how it functions best. I would say this way of making is also deeply related to my ADHD. I never make just one sculpture at once. I'm always making 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6, just because I can't actually keep my attention on one for that long. And that is also sort of what determines the size, as a bigger project would require me to drop my dopamine-driven intuition. So they all tend to be between 20 and 40 centimeters in each direction instead. Another bigger part of my practice is yarn and wool. I like the potential it gives because there's an inherent distrust to its ability to hold things up, especially in this sculpture where there's a lot of worry about it crashing to the ground, although I know that it will usually hold up quite well. In the sculpture there's like a similar kind of tension. I actually watched people at the Mafia 4 and 5 show sort of stand next to it and consider if they should try to toss it over or break it, because it is just being held up by the friction of wool against wool. But I think there's something quite beautiful and also queer about challenging the possibility of wool as a material through this. A big visual mark of my arts has been grids, squares and cubes, which I think can be traced back to the art and environments that have historically influenced me. So I was really into Bauhaus, especially the tapestries, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and I still find them influencing me quite a lot. I love Edoardo Palazzi's way of matching more industrial and ecological human forms. And to me, these are like representations of how I see humans interact with technology. I especially like this work by Palozzi because apparently he took it apart and reconfigured it and took it apart again and reconfigured it again, and I think that's quite a similar process to mine. And I also like that you can see like the material origins in the sculptures in like the metal bars that he used. This idea of remnants is also what draws me towards Eva Kochatova's installations, where she responds to historic injustice with both care and memory, but also humor, and she lets the exhibition space expand into the entire building, which I think is a bit like the way that injustice is expanded to all aspects of the man-made world. Another big influence on me is architecture. So I grew up in Bielefeld, Germany, which is a town that was massively expanded in the early 20th century into industry and then got bombed during World War II because of that industry, and then got rebuilt in a very brutalist style. And this is a university which has been called the ugliest building in the world. It was built between 1971 and 1976 and sort of looks quite intimidating, but it's actually built on democratic values. So like there's a department in each wing of the building and they have the same rooms on each floor. So like each department has a student union room on the first floor, and the idea was that you could just walk in between faculties, and there was like this unity between academic disciplines and interdisciplinarity inherent to like the architectural style. And I actually went to school right next door to the university. I was educated at the Laborschule in Bielefeld, which is an experimental school that's run by the university. And it's this like 50-year-long experiment. And my mom was also working at the university for some years during my childhood, so I spent a lot of my life growing up between these kind of like brutalist structures, which can be perceived as oppressive, but for me they're like centers of democracy and learning instead. Another big influence on me is this house. It's the Meunier House in Cambridgeshire, where I lived for 2 years from age 12 to 14, and which was a very formative time because it was the time when I sort of realized art was something people actually did, and it was something I could pursue, and it was also the time when I learned about art history and was considering studying architecture. And you can see that in the original floor plan, the building is completely square with two intersecting squares and then terraces added to either side to like complete the square. And while this is a really modernist building, it's also an attempt at bridging between modernism and nature because it's placed inside an orchard that's actually older than the houses. And living there was incredibly formative, and I think my obsession with cubes and sort of rectangular shapes can be traced back both to this and the gridded style of the university in Bielefeld. But then obviously there's something quite rigid about modernism. It's also a bit toxic. It sort of denies the randomness that is inherent to nature, where trees grow into all different kinds of directions. So I'm interested in disrupting the cube and grids in different ways of recreating it. In cyanotypes and monoprints, as well as the objects that I'm printing, which are these crocheted grids. And by doing that, I'm denying the grid its rigidity and like staying power, I would say. And then I'm also quite interested in cubes and disrupting cubes by embroidering onto them and letting them fall apart and so on. However, I find that in exhibitions, when I then place my art on plinths, the cube is like reintroduced as like the main form of presentation to the work. And as we've seen in the architecture I'm interested in the approachability and democracy of it rather than the misconception of a blank slate, because no such thing exists, I think. So I've instead been doing these more ad hoc ways of presenting my sculptures, like hanging them on walls, which give them even more clarity and makes them a bit stranger. And I enjoy the wall presentation the most at the moment because it means they do take on something painterly, but they also seem to become part of the architecture, a part of the building, or emerging out of it. And that relates back to the architecture influence, but together with the ad hoc construction of my sculptures also reflects the impact of the human-made environment on us.